2 a.m. A karate champion sits on an ER gurney under fluorescent light, a paper gown pulled over a chest full of gold trophies he cannot stop thinking about. And his hands shake so hard, the nurse has to hold his own clipboard steady for him so his signature comes out legible. That nurse is the woman he humiliated in front of his entire dojo 6 weeks ago. He does not look at her face. He cannot. Freeze that image. Hold it there. Now go back 6 weeks, to the night this really started, in a strip mall karate school, wedged between a nail salon and a phone repair shop. On a stretch of Mapleton Road that smells like wet asphalt and cheap cologne, applied too heavy in a locker room. Bedpans are that way. Sweetheart, mats are for fighters. Dustin Kroll's voice cracked off the mirrored wall of Mapleton Championship Karate like a slap across the whole room. He stood dead center of the mat in a gold-trimmed black belt with his own name embroidered across the front in thread that cost more than the gi Elena Marsh was still zipping up. 20 students turned to look at once. A few laughed on command. The specific hollow laugh a room learns when it's more afraid of being the next target than it is embarrassed for the current one. A clipboard in Marcus's hand went briefly still, knuckles whitening slightly around the edge of it. Patrice Holloway, 61 years old, cafeteria cook at Mapleton Elementary, dropped her eyes to the floor like the joke had somehow landed on her instead. Elena stood at the mat's edge in sock feet, gym bag still slung over one shoulder, her county general badge still clipped to the strap from a 12-hour shift she'd walked here straight from. Her scrubs were folded at the bottom of the bag under a spare set of wraps. She said nothing. The mat squeaked under a dozen shifting feet. Somewhere behind the front desk, a space heater ticked as it cooled. The whole room smelled like rubber matting dry erase marker and the pre-workout powder Dustin's training partners went through by the tub. Dustin spat his mouthguard onto the mat near her feet. A habit, a signature. The thing he did before every demonstration so everyone remembered who owned the floor. And grinned at the room like he'd just landed a punchline instead of an insult. "Write this down, nurse," he said, louder now, working the crowd he already had. "Visiting hours are over on my mat." The laugh came again, thinner. A few of the newer white belts were already watching Elena's face instead of Dustin's and finding nothing there worth laughing at. Her pulse did not jump. A camera trained on her collarbone instead of her humiliation would have shown it. Steady, even, unbothered. The resting rhythm of someone who has done math under worse pressure than a strip mall insults. She counted to 4 in her head. The same silent 4 count she used walking into a trauma bay at 3 in the morning, and then she bowed. Not to Dustin, to the mat itself, and stepped past him the way you step past a chair somebody left in the wrong place. Marcus, the assistant instructor, 26 years old, had been chewing on his whistle cord out of habit since warm-ups. He stopped mid-chew. He didn't know why. Something in the total economy of that movement. No flinch, no flush, no wasted motion, snagged at something in the back of his brain and refused to let go. Nobody in that dojo had any idea what they were looking at. Nobody knew that the tired-looking night shift nurse they'd just watched get called sweetheart had spent 8 years as a Navy corpsman attached to Marine Raider battalions, patching men back together on helicopter decks while rotor wash tore at the stretchers, and the whole world tried to kill everyone on it at once. Nobody knew she had carried grown men twice, Dustin's weight across ground built to swallow them whole. And nobody, not one single person in that packed strip mall dojo, knew that 6 weeks from this exact second, in front of every one of them plus a trophy table besides, this joke was going to end so hard it would still be the first thing anyone in Mapleton mentioned at a diner counter a year later. What is coming for Dustin Kroll is bigger than anything that gold-trimmed belt has ever seen. Stay with this one. But before we continue, subscribe now and tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what time you saw this video. Tonight's story is one you will never forget. Elena didn't start karate looking for a fight. She started because silence had a habit of turning into ringing in her ears, if she didn't fill it with something structured and repetitive. 12-hour shifts do that to a person. Codes called at 4 in the morning do that to a person. Hands that have to move fast and clean every single time, no exceptions, no do-overs. That kind of pressure rewires you permanently. And when it's done rewiring you, it leaves you needing somewhere quiet to put the leftover current. 2 deployments taught her the discipline underneath everything she did now. Check the airway. Check the pulse. Count the breaths out loud so your own hands don't start shaking before the patient's do. A helicopter deck at 2 in the morning. Rotor wash tearing sideways rain across a stretcher. A Marine's blood soaking warm through her gloves while she kept her voice flat and told him he was fine. He was fine. Stay with me. Keep your eyes on me. That kind of night rewrites what counts as stressful for the rest of a person's life. After that, a strip mall dojo with a vending machine humming in the lobby and a laminated schedule taped to the front door felt almost like a nap. She wanted the forms, the breathing drills, the quiet, exact repetition of a technique done the same way 1,000 times until it lived in the muscle instead of the mind. She did not want a fight. She had already had enough fighting to last 2 lifetimes and hand-deliver the leftovers to a third. She remembered one deck in particular, the way a person remembers weather more clearly than dates. Rain sideways in the rotor wash. A corpsman's headlamp the only light that mattered. A young Marine named Race gripping her wrist so hard she still carried the faint white scar of his thumbnail 2 years afterward. She hadn't told him he was fine that night. She'd told him the truth. Hang on, 30 more seconds. I've got you. Don't you dare close your eyes. Because lying to a frightened man buys you nothing but his mistrust the next time it counts. She carried that lesson into every room she walked into after that, including a strip mall dojo that smelled like rubber mats and drugstore cologne. Say only what's true. Move only when it actually helps somebody. Everything else is noise, and noise gets people killed, on a deck or on a mat. She kept showing up anyway, 3 nights a week, between shifts, because Patrice needed somebody in the back row who didn't laugh when Dustin picked his targets. Elena had watched women like Patrice her whole life, women who worked brutal hours for low pay and asked for nothing extra, then got treated like furniture by men who had never once had to carry anyone heavier than their own ego off a battlefield or a gurney. She told herself she'd keep her head down, do her forms, go home, sleep 4 hours, and come back for another shift. Her oath was a hospital oath, not a dojo one. Some habits, though, don't stay inside the building where you learned them. She could have quit after that first night. Plenty of people would have, and nobody would have blamed her for it. She thought about it, actually, sitting in her car in the parking lot afterward, engine running, heater ticking. But quitting felt like handing Dustin something he hadn't earned, and handing him things he hadn't earned was exactly the problem in the first place. So she went back the following Tuesday. Same sock feet, same folded scrubs at the bottom of her bag, and said nothing about any of it to anyone. The night before that wrist lock, Elena had spent 12 hours at County General running a trauma bay through a 3-car pileup on Route 9. A resident half her age had frozen at the sight of an open fracture, and Elena had stepped past him without raising her voice, called the numbers out loud, packed the wound, and had the patient stabilized and moving toward imaging before the resident finished apologizing. Her charge nurse, watching from the doorway, had said only, "Marsh, you ever think about teaching?" Elena had laughed once, short and tired, and said she already had a class 3 nights a week that didn't pay her anything and didn't need her expertise either. She drove home at 6 in the morning with the sun coming up flat and gray over the parking garage, slept 4 hours, and showed up to the dojo that same evening in the same sock feet as always, badge still clipped to her bag. Nobody in that room having the faintest idea what her last 12 hours had actually looked like. 2 weeks after the bedpan line, Dustin decided the mat needed a demonstration, and he decided Elena would be the prop. He grabbed her wrist in front of the entire beginner's row, announced he was showing proper joint control for self-defense, and cranked the lock 3 full speeds past teaching pace. The kind of pressure meant to make a person wince fast, tap fast, and give the room a memory to laugh about at the water fountain later. "This is what happens," Dustin narrated to the row, not looking at Elena's face at all, only at the row of white belts watching him. "When somebody who doesn't train tries to fight somebody who does." She wrote it instead, the way she'd been trained to ride pain that wasn't supposed to matter. Weight dropped low, breathing even, face doings, absolutely nothing interesting. A bead of sweat slid down Dustin's temple from the effort of holding the lock at that pressure. Hers stayed dry. "Tap," he said, "quieter now." An edge creeping into it that hadn't been there a second before. "Tap, nurse." "You'll have to work harder than that," she said, calm as a vitals reading. And that was the exact moment he shoved for the last extra inch, chasing the reaction he felt owed. His own glove seam, the fancy embroidered ones, with his sponsor's logo stitched into the cuff, split wide open at the palm, with a sound the whole front row heard clearly. The class snickered. Not at Elena, at the rip, Dustin's ears went red under the fluorescent lights. He dropped her wrist like it had burned him and barked at everyone to get back to their partners. His voice pitched a half step too loud for a correction that small. A week later, he turned on Patrice. He made her run her kata alone in front of the entire class, narrating every stumble to the room like a broadcaster calling a blowout loss. "Left foot's wrong again," he called out, arms crossed, pacing a slow circle around her like a man inspecting a used car. "How many months has it been now? 6? 7? And that's the best you've got." Patrice's hands trembled at her sides, but she kept moving through the form, jaw set, refusing to stop. "Some people pay fees just to embarrass the sign out front," he said, grinning at his own line, waiting for the laugh he was already sure was coming his way. He got the laugh. He also got a sharp crack of glass, because at that exact second his newest first-place photo, the one from the fall regionals, the one he made white belts dust twice a week, slid off its nail on the trophy wall and hit the floor corner first. The frame split diagonally straight across his own smiling face in the picture. A few of the older students went quiet in a different register than before. The specific quiet of people who don't believe in signs, but suddenly remember every superstition their grandmothers ever taught them. Nobody said a word out loud. Nobody had to. Patrice finished her kata anyway, chin down, hands trembling just slightly at the wrists, the only tell in the whole room. Elena watched those hands the entire time and said nothing, because saying something out loud in that moment wasn't hers to do. Not yet. But the debt was already stacking. 3 weeks in, sparring night arrived. And sparring night was where Dustin liked to remind the whole dojo exactly why his record stayed undefeated. He paired himself against a 16-year-old green belt named Tyler, a kid built like a coat rack, joined for confidence 6 months earlier, and gotten Dustin Kroll instead. Dustin went full contact from the opening bell. Not sport contact, not the padded, controlled contact posted right there on the dojo's own laminated rules sheet by the front door. Full weight, full speed, the exact shot that had never once failed him against anyone smaller, slower, and less trained than the young Marines who used to bleed onto Elena Marsh's gloved hands at 2 a.m, a decade earlier. Tyler went down hard, the back of his skull bouncing once off the mat, with a flat, ugly sound that made every parent in the folding chairs sit forward at the exact same moment, a wave of motion rippling straight down the row. Dustin stood over him, flexed for the mirror, checked his own form in the reflection, instead of checking the 16-year-old on the floor in front of him. Elena was already moving before Sensei Siddiqui finished half rising out of his chair by the front desk. She crossed the mat low and fast, dropped to one knee beside Tyler, and had a penlight out of her gym bag before anyone else in the room had finished gasping. She checked his pupils, left, then right, comparing them out loud in a flat, clinical voice that had never once belonged in a strip mall dojo. She checked the pulse at his wrist. She asked him to follow her finger without moving his head. She did all of it in under 30 seconds, the exact way you do it when 30 seconds is the entire distance between fine and not fine. The room went silent in a different way than it had for the cracked picture frame. This wasn't superstition anymore. This was the sudden, uncomfortable feeling of watching somebody who clearly knew something none of the rest of them did. Sensei Siddiqui hovered a few feet back, hands hanging useless at his sides, saying nothing useful, only repeating, "Is he okay? Is he okay?" in a voice that offered no actual help to anyone. "He's okay," Elena said, not looking up, still working through her checks. Pupils equal, talking clear. She glanced once at Tyler's face. "Tyler, can you tell me what day it is?" "Saturday," the boy said, voice small and a little shaky. "Good. Keep him sitting another minute before he tries to stand." She looked up finally at Siddiqui. "He needs to be seen tonight, not tomorrow. Tonight." Elena's phone buzzed in her gym bag that same night. An old number she still had saved under a first name only. Reyes, checking in the way he did every few months, a habit neither of them had ever bothered to break. "You still babysitting karate kids?" he texted. "One of them almost cracked his skull tonight," she typed back. "Champion of the place doesn't know how to pull a punch. Might have to say something eventually." "You always say that. You never do." "Oath's an oath," she wrote, and put the phone away before he could send back the joke she knew was coming. The one about how her oath had gotten both of them yelled at by a battalion surgeon, once for the exact same reason. She'd stayed quiet about something that needed saying, right up until the moment it absolutely couldn't wait any longer. In the women's locker room afterward, while Tyler's mother signed him out at the front desk, Patrice found Elena rewrapping her own knuckles at the bench. "You didn't even blink," Patrice said. 20 years I've watched people flinch at a raised voice in that cafeteria. You didn't blink once." "Training," Elena said, not looking up from the wrap. "That why you're always counting? I've seen your lips move. 1, 2, 3, 4, every time he opens his mouth." Elena tied off the wrap and finally met her eyes. "It's how I keep my hands steady when somebody's trying to make them shake. Works on kids in a trauma bay. Works on grown men in a strip mall, too." Patrice sat down heavy on the bench, the fight going out of her shoulders for just a second. The mask she wore in front of Dustin finally slipping. "I'm 61 years old. I don't need a black belt. I needed to stop feeling like a joke 5 nights a week." "You're not the joke," Elena said. "You never were. He just needed somebody smaller than him to point at, so nobody looked at him too close." Neither of them knew yet how true that second sentence really was, or how soon the whole dojo would find out exactly what Dustin Kroll didn't want anybody looking at. Later that same week, during a water break, a stack of paper cups tipped off the front desk when somebody bumped it reaching for a towel. Elena's hand shot out and caught the top cup before it hit the ground, water barely rippling, without her ever once looking up from tying her belt. Nobody but Marcus noticed. He filed that away too, next to everything else he hadn't asked about yet. A younger white belt near the back, maybe 14, finally said out loud what half the room was already thinking. Where did she learn that? Nobody answered him. Dustin. Humiliated by a shift of attention, he had never once had to share with anybody in that building, turned the question into a challenge instead of sitting with it. "You want the spotlight so bad, nurse," he said, loud enough for the whole dojo to hear. "Let's make it official. Annual tournament. Friendly demonstration. You and me, in front of everybody who actually showed up to watch real fighters." Sensei Imran Siddiqui, 55 years old, decent once. Now, leaning so hard on Dustin's trophy case to make rent every month that he'd stopped noticing the weight of it, said absolutely nothing. He looked down at his own shoes, the same way Patrice had looked at hers weeks before. The silence from a man who was supposed to protect the students in his own building was its own particular cruelty, and it should make the viewer just as furious as anything Dustin has said out loud. Because decency in that room had a price tag on it, and Siddiqui had already decided what he was willing to sell. Marcus, standing near the equipment rack, opened his mouth like he wanted to say something, glanced at Siddiqui for backup that never came, and closed it again. He'd started noticing things about Elena he couldn't quite explain to himself. The way she moved to help Tyler before anybody else's brain had caught up to what was happening. The way her eyes swept the exits of a room the second she walked into it. A habit he'd only ever seen in one other person, a veteran uncle who never talked about what he'd done overseas either. Marcus didn't say any of that out loud yet. He just watched and filed it away. The way you file away a question you already suspect has a bigger answer than you're ready for. Elena didn't answer the challenge that night. She packed her bag, checked on Tyler one more time from the doorway to make sure his mother had arrived to take him for observation, and left without another word. What almost nobody in that dojo understood, what the viewer is about to learn before anyone in Mapleton does, is that Elena carried a second secret about Dustin Kroll, one far bigger than her own service record, and it had nothing to do with karate at all. 3 weeks before the bedpan line, Dustin had come through her ER alone. At 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, scared in a way he had never once let anyone see on a mat. Rib pain. A hit taken wrong in an unsanctioned exhibition match he wasn't supposed to be fighting in. One his sponsors and his federation didn't know existed. The imaging showed something he did not want spoken out loud, let alone written down anywhere near his official tournament paperwork. Elena had been the nurse on shift that night. She'd seen the scan herself on the monitor in full clinical detail. She'd overheard him beg the attending physician, low and fast and humiliated, to keep it off the record he had to sign for his federation's medical clearance. She had said nothing then, and she would say nothing later, because her oath said that patient information stayed exactly where the patient gave it to her, regardless of how that same patient behaved on a mat 3 weeks afterward. It didn't matter that he'd since called her sweetheart in front of 20 strangers. It didn't matter that he'd made an old woman narrate her own humiliation to a laughing room. The oath wasn't conditional on the patient deserving it. That was the whole point of it, and it was also, she knew, the exact flaw that let this go on as long as it did. Every 300 words in this story so far, There's been a small reminder hiding in plain sight. The count to 4. The pupils checked without hesitation. The penlight that lived in a gym bag instead of a purse. Here's the next one, and it's the biggest yet. Elena caught Dustin alone in the hallway after class, near the humming vending machine, where nobody else could hear. Dustin. A minute. He rolled his eyes, arms crossed over his chest. Already bracing for another lecture he planned to ignore before it even started. "I was on shift 3 weeks ago," she said, voice low, flat, careful, the exact tone she used delivering bad news to families in a quiet hospital corridor. "I know what's on your scan. I know why you didn't want it written down for your federation. One wrong hit. The kind you threw on Tyler tonight. And it isn't your ranking on the line anymore. I'm not telling anyone. That's not how any of this works, and it never will be. But you cannot keep fighting like this. Not with what's still healing in there." He went very still. "How do you even?" "I was your nurse," she said simply. 11 o'clock, a Tuesday. You don't remember my face because you were scared. And it was dark outside the window, and you weren't looking at anybody's face that night. I remember yours because that's my job. So what? You've been sitting on this? Watching me? Waiting for some leverage? I've been doing exactly what my license requires me to do, which is nothing out loud, ever, to anyone," Elena said. "I'm telling you now, once, as a person, not as a nurse. Because a 16-year-old hit the mat tonight, and it could have been you throwing that shot with a rib that isn't ready for it snapping the wrong way instead." For 2 full seconds, something honest crossed Dustin Kroll's face. Fear, plain and unguarded, the exact look of a 24-year-old realizing the floor under his entire identity might not hold his weight much longer. It is the only crack the viewer will ever get from him, and it changes absolutely nothing about what he does next. His jaw set hard. The arrogance slammed back down over his face like a visor. "You're lying," he said, loud enough that 2 students walking out toward the parking lot turned their heads to look. "You don't know the first thing about my body. You're a burnt-out night shift nurse, making up medical stories. Because you want attention, you're never going to get on a mat. Stay off my sparring line and stay out of my business." He walked away before she could answer, and she let him go. Because arguing further in a hallway wasn't going to fix what a scan couldn't lie about, and because some information only gets used once, in the right room, at the right volume, and this hallway, at this hour, was not that room. The viewer now knows something almost nobody in Mapleton does. The undefeated champion is fighting on borrowed time. The only person who knows it is also the only person protecting him from it. And he has just called her a liar for the crime of trying. Marcus caught Elena in the parking lot. 2 nights later, jacket collar turned up against the February wind, breath fogging under the one working street lamp. "Can I ask you something?" he said, "and you don't have to answer if it's out of line. Go ahead. My uncle does that thing you do." The eyes, checking the room before he checks anything else. He was in Fallujah 2 tours. Never talks about it unless somebody else brings it up first. Marcus shifted his weight. "You do the same thing. every single class. Elena zipped her jacket, considered him for a second, and decided he'd earned something honest, if not everything. I was a corpsman. Navy, attached out with the Marines for a stretch of it. That's all I've got for you tonight, Marcus. That's more than I expected, he said. For what it's worth, what you did for Tyler, that penlight thing, that wasn't karate. That was somebody who's done that 100 times before, for real. A lot more than 100, Elena said quietly, and got in her car before he could ask the next question already forming on his face. It did not take long after that for the debts to start coming due, one after another, each one bigger than the last. Tyler's mother filed a formal written complaint with the dojo the following Monday morning, citing excessive contact against a minor in a supervised sparring class, with a coach standing right there watching it happen. She'd sat up half the night in the ER waiting room after Elena's warning, and by the time the doctor cleared Tyler with a mild concussion diagnosis and a week off school, she'd already decided exactly what she was going to say to Siddiqui's face. 2 other families withdrew their children from the program that same week, and they did not do it quietly. They said exactly why, loudly, standing at the front desk while other parents waited in line behind them to hear every word. We're not paying somebody to let our kid get concussed for a demonstration. And Sensei Siddiqui stood behind the counter, suddenly very interested in a clipboard that had nothing written on it worth reading. A regional tournament official running a routine audit after the complaint reached the Federation's desk pulled old footage from a prior event and found Dustin landing a shot well past legal contact limits against a different green belt months earlier. Evidence that had been sitting there the whole time, waiting for someone to finally look. His seeding for the upcoming tournament got quietly dropped 2 full brackets without a phone call or a warning. He found out about it from a screenshot forwarded in a group chat he wasn't supposed to still be part of, sent by somebody who used to call him a friend and clearly didn't feel much like one anymore. And in class that same week, in front of everyone, Patrice Holloway, 61 years old, cafeteria cook, the woman Dustin had spent months teaching the whole room to laugh at, landed her first clean hip throw, not against a beginner brought in to make her look good, against Dustin's own favorite training partner, a cocky brown belt who had never once taken her seriously in 8 months of class. The mat shook under the impact. The room went dead silent for a half second, then erupted, and the applause for a 61-year-old lunch lady's first clean throw ran longer and louder than anything Dustin Kroll had ever gotten walking off that same mat with a trophy in his hands. He heard every second of it from the locker room. He did not come out to see what it looked like. A coach from a rival dojo 2 towns over called Siddiqui directly that week, half joking, half serious. Heard your golden boys finally got some competition. A nurse of all people. My guys want tickets just to watch him eat those words. Siddiqui laughed it off on the phone and hung up feeling worse than he had before it rang, because some part of him already suspected the joke wasn't going to land the way the rival coach thought it would. Word travels fast in a town the size of Mapleton. By the time tournament week rolled around, half the counter at the Blue Plate Diner on Main Street had heard some version of the story. The nurse who'd checked a kid's pupils with a penlight in the middle of a sparring floor. The photo that cracked itself off the wall mid-insult. The champion who couldn't stop bringing up a woman he swore didn't matter to him at all. Nobody outside that dojo had the whole picture yet. Nobody but Elena knew about the scan sitting quiet in a hospital file. But something in the air of that town had leaned forward toward one single Saturday night. The specific way a room leans in before a punchline it can already half feel coming. And not one of them had any real sense yet of how big that punchline was actually about to land. In the men's locker room an hour before doors opened, Dustin stood in front of the mirror taping his ribs himself, alone, wincing at an angle nobody was supposed to see. He'd told his own sponsor rep the rap was for a pulled muscle. He pressed his palm flat against his side and breathed shallow, testing it the way a man tests ice before he puts his full weight on it. He caught his own eyes in the mirror for a second too long, and for just that second, he looked less like a champion and more like a scared 24-year-old standing under bad lighting. Then he pulled his gi top on over the tape, squared his shoulders, and walked out into the noise like none of that had happened at all. Tournament night arrived on a cold Saturday in February. The specific cold that smells like wet asphalt and salt, and somebody's cologne applied, one spray too heavy, in a crowded locker room. The dojo had rented folding chairs from the community center down the street and lined them up 3 rows deep on every side of the mat. Families packed shoulder to shoulder, phones already raised before the first scheduled match had even started. Somebody's paper coffee cup crumpled under a nervous grip near the concession table. The trophy table gleamed gold under the fluorescent lights at the front of the room. Exactly the kind of stage Dustin Kroll had spent his whole life building his identity around filling to the last inch. Kids in fresh white belts warmed up in the corner, parents fussing with camera angles, a folding table of participation trophies waiting near the door for the youngest brackets. 2 visiting dojos had bussed teams in from the next county over, their coaches sizing up Mapleton's mat the way visiting coaches always do, murmuring to each other behind clipboards. Somewhere near the concession stand, a kid dropped a paper cup of orange soda, and nobody even turned to look because every eye in the building that night was saving itself for one thing. He seized the house microphone before the first sanctioned match even began. Feedback squealing once through the speakers before he wrestled it under control, grinning out at the packed chairs like a man who'd never once lost anything in his life. "Before we get to the real fights tonight," he said, "I promised everybody a demonstration." He turned and found Elena in the 3rd row, gym bag at her feet, scrubs folded neatly inside it, same as always, off shift for exactly 1 night. "Bedpans are that way, sweetheart. Come show everybody what you learned from all that paperwork." Same line, twice as loud, twice as many witnesses. A folding chair scraped hard against the floor as somebody's father half rose without meaning to. A woman 2 rows back whispered, "No way," to the stranger sitting beside her. Somewhere in the crowd, a phone that had been filming lazily snapped into a tighter, more deliberate frame and stayed there. Elena stood up, walked to the edge of the mat, and did not step onto it. "I'm not doing this," she said, voice even, carrying easily without needing volume behind it. "Sit down, Dustin. You do not want this tonight, and I think part of you already knows why." The room laughed the way it had laughed 6 weeks earlier, nervous, uneasy, following his lead purely out of habit. Because following his lead was the only routine this room had ever practiced together. "Scared, sweetheart?" Dustin called out, working the mic like a showman, playing to the sponsor banners as much as the crowd. "Or is it just easier to sit there, in the cheap seats, and let everybody think you're something you're not?" "I've warned you once," Elena said. "That's the only warning you get from me." "Warned me about what?" He laughed, tossing the question to the crowd like it was rhetorical. "About your feelings?" Dustin dropped the mic onto an empty chair and closed the distance himself, throwing the exact overhand shot he'd used to put a 16-year-old flat on his back weeks earlier. Full weight, full speed. The shot that had never once failed him against anyone smaller and slower and less trained than the men who used to bleed onto Elena Marsh's gloved hands on a helicopter deck at 2 in the morning, years before he was old enough to understand what that deck had cost the people standing on it. She was not where the punch went. It happened in 1 full second. His own momentum met a foot sweep timed like a metronome, low, precise, no wasted motion anywhere in it. And the undefeated regional champion of Mapleton Championship Karate hit the mat flat on his back, in front of every family in the building. Every sponsor banner hung along the back wall. Every phone held up and recording. The impact knocked the wind out of him with a short, ugly grunt, and his hand went instinctively to the taped ribs under his gi before it went anywhere near defending himself. Elena's knee found his shoulder blade before the collective gasp had even finished traveling to the back row. Her weight distributed exactly, her balance calm, her breathing unchanged, her free hand already reading the tension in his shoulder the way she'd read 1,000 patients under her hands before him. A teenage girl in the second row stood halfway up out of her folding chair, hand pressed flat over her mouth. An older man near the trophy table muttered, "Get up! Get up!" under his breath, then went quiet when it became obvious Dustin wasn't getting anywhere. Somebody's toddler started crying at the sudden noise and got hushed and bounced by a parent who never once took their eyes off the mat. The visiting coach, 3 chairs over, had both hands laced on top of his head, elbows out, the universal posture of a man, watching something he was going to be asked about for the rest of the season. "Tap when you're ready," she said at conversation volume, like she was talking somebody through their own vitals in a quiet trauma bay. "I've carried bigger men than you off worse floors than this one." He struggled once against the angle. It went nowhere. The pressure held steady, controlled, clinical, never once tipping into anything more than it needed to be. He tapped the mat hard, 3 times in a row, and she released him the instant his palm touched down. No extra second held for effect, no lingering. Absolutely no strike thrown after the surrender, because punishing him further was never the point of any of this. Then, in front of the entire room, she did the one thing that landed harder than the pin itself. She checked him, took his wrist gently to find his pulse, watched his breathing rise and fall for 3 full seconds, exactly the way a professional clears a patient rather than the way a fighter gloats over a beaten opponent. The gesture said, without a single cruel word attached to it, that she had never once seen him as a threat worth fearing, only as someone she was trained to make sure was okay, whether or not he'd ever once earned that. "Lower your voice," she added quietly just for him, handing back almost word for word what she'd told him weeks earlier in that empty hallway by the vending machine. "You'll want the oxygen later." His mouth guard, the one he'd spat toward Elena's feet on the very first night as a signature move, popped loose from his own teeth on impact and skittered across the mat into the front row, landing at the exact spot where he used to stand and hold court. Nobody laughed this time. The silence that followed was heavier than any laugh could have been. Marcus, the assistant instructor, stood up near the back row with his phone already unlocked, scrolling fast, reading straight off the screen in a voice that cracked halfway through the sentence. 8 years, he said, loud enough that the whole room caught every word. Navy Corpsman, Marine Raider battalions. We had a combat medic training on our mats this whole time, and he called her sweetheart. Dead silence swallowed the room whole. Then a murmur spread wide. Chair to chair, whisper to whisper. Somebody's phone slipping flat out of their hand and clattering on the floor without anybody bothering to reach down for it right away. A coach from a visiting dojo, 3 chairs over, went half out of his seat and just stood there frozen, mouth slightly open, staring at the mat like it had rearranged itself in front of him. The karma landed item by item after that, right there, in front of exactly the people Dustin Kroll had spent every month of his life trying to impress. Elena stood over him, not gloating, simply present, still checking the rhythm of his breathing out of pure reflex, and handed his own words back to him, 1 line at a time, verbatim. "Visiting hours are over on my mat," she said. "That's what you told me the first night. Bedpans are that way, sweetheart. That's what you told me tonight. In front of every family in this room." She looked toward Patrice, sitting quiet and upright in the 3rd row, hands folded neatly in her lap, chin lifted for the first time in months. Some people pay fees just to embarrass the sign out front. That's what you told her. Patrice's chin came up another inch. Somebody near her started clapping, slow at first, and then it caught. The way applause catches when a whole room has been waiting weeks for permission to finally let it out. Tyler's mother stood up in the 2nd row, arms crossed, voice carrying clean across the mat. "This is exactly what I told you was going to happen. Exactly this." Sensei Siddiqui, cornered on every side now by parents who had waited a long time for a room loud enough to finally say something in, walked stiffly to the front of the mat and reached for the patch stitched onto Dustin's sleeve. The assistant instructor patch, the one that had given him direct authority over kids, exactly like Tyler. "Not anymore," Siddiqui said, and pulled it free, the fabric tearing slightly at one loose corner stitch. His voice shook, but he didn't stop. "You don't teach in this building again. Not until I say so. And I'm not saying so." It was the first thing he'd done right in months, and every single person in that room knew exactly how overdue it was. The tournament board suspended Dustin's competition status before the night was even fully over. Pending a medical clearance, nobody in that building believed he had any chance of passing. Because Elena had been right about the scan the whole time. And everyone was finally about to find out how right. In a written report, a doctor would file, with no hallway oath standing in the way of it this time. By Monday morning, the sign-up sheet, taped to the front counter at Mapleton Championship Karate, had a new line on it that had never once existed before. A women's self-defense class, 6 names deep before lunch, and still climbing by the hour. Phones ringing off the hook with more. Tyler's mother called the front desk that same morning, not to complain this time, but to ask if Elena would consider teaching part of it herself. Patrice signed up to assist and taped a handwritten note next to the sheet that just said, in block letters, "Ask about the hip throw." Somebody laughed reading it. Nobody took it down. The sponsor, whose logo had been stitched into Dustin's ripped glove, weeks earlier issued a short statement by the following Wednesday, quietly dissolving the partnership, effective immediately, pending review. His trophy wall stayed up in the lobby for another month. Gathering dust, nobody assigned a white belt to clean, until Siddiqui finally took it down himself on a slow Tuesday afternoon and never mentioned why. The phone-fin footage from tournament night made its way around Mapleton fast. The way footage like that always does in a town small enough that everybody knows somebody who was in the room. By Sunday afternoon, it had been shared at the Blue Plate diner counter a dozen times over coffee, and by Monday, the assistant manager at the hardware store 2 doors down was telling customers about the nurse who dropped the Karate Kid before they'd even asked. Nobody in Mapleton needed a headline to know exactly which nurse he meant. Marcus took over daytime classes within the month, and the first thing he did, with Siddiqui's quiet blessing, the kind of blessing that comes from a man trying to make up for lost time, was ask Elena if she'd co-teach the new self-defense sessions. She said yes on the condition that nobody ever call her instructor out loud. Patrice signed up for every session and did eventually teach the hip throw to 2 other cafeteria workers from the elementary school, neither of whom had ever set foot on a mat before in their lives. Dustin came back to the dojo exactly once during his suspension, on a slow Thursday afternoon, to collect the gear left in his old locker. He passed the spot on the wall where his trophy photos used to hang, now bare. 4 small nail holes and a faint rectangle of unfaded paint, the only proof they'd ever been there at all. He didn't linger. He didn't say anything to Siddiqui on his way out. Whatever conversation he was having with himself that afternoon, He was having it alone, the way a man does when the room he built his whole identity inside of no longer has a seat saved for him. 6 weeks later, the ER at County General hummed the same way it always hummed at 2 in the morning. Fluorescent light buzzing faintly overhead, gurney wheels squeaking on old tile. That same vending machine somewhere down the hall, dispensing bad coffee to a night full of worse decisions. Dustin Kroll sat on a gurney in a paper gown. Career paused indefinitely. Sponsorship gone quiet, ranking frozen mid-season. Hands shaking so badly the intake nurse had to steady the clipboard for him, just so his signature came out legible enough to file. The nurse was Elena Marsh. She did not gloat. She did not remind him of a single thing that had happened on that mat 6 weeks earlier. She checked his vitals with the same clean, unhurried hands she'd used on a helicopter deck years before he was even old enough to understand what that deck had cost the men standing on it. The same hands she'd used to pin him flat on a strip mall floor in front of his whole dojo. Blood pressure cuff, pulse ox on his finger. A pen-light check out of pure habit, even though nobody had asked for one. She wrote his numbers down on the chart. Voice even, professional, giving him nothing to react to and nothing to perform for. Because there was no audience left in this room, and she had never once needed one. Ribs healing slower than it should, she said, glancing at the new imaging on the screen beside the bed. You're going to need another 6 weeks minimum before anybody clears you for contact again. He nodded at the floor, all the fight gone out of his shoulders. Guess I should have listened the first time. Guess so, Elena said, without any edge in it at all, and moved on to the next task on her list without a wasted second. As he stood to leave, discharge papers folded under one arm. He stopped at the door. He turned around. And for the first time since Elena had walked into that dojo months earlier in her sock feet, with a gym bag slung over one shoulder, Dustin Kroll bowed to her. Properly. Chin down, the way he had never once bowed to anyone standing on that mat, including his own instructor. Elena nodded once and went back to her charts. Down the hall, her charge nurse leaned against the doorway of the break room, having caught the tail end of it through the glass. That the one from the video? She asked. That's him, Elena said, not looking up from the chart in her hands. You could have said something to somebody by now. Would have saved that kid a concussion. Maybe, Elena said. Or maybe it just would have cost somebody else something they didn't deserve to lose either. Some weeks there's no version where everybody walks away clean. She finished the note, capped her pen, and reached for the next file on the rack, already moving on to whatever the next 12 hours had waiting for her. Quiet strength doesn't need an audience to be real. It only needs to still be there the moment it's finally asked for. Every karma beat in this story has already been paid out in full. The torn glove, the cracked photo frame, the lost sponsor, the dropped seating, the stripped patch, the packed self-defense sheet. And none of it came from Elena reaching for revenge. It came from a room finally seeing what had been standing in it the whole time. That's the part worth sitting with longest. Here's a question worth sitting with tonight. Elena knew a secret weeks before Dustin ever threw that punch on tournament night. A secret that might have stopped him from hurting a 16-year-old boy who never should have taken a full contact shot in a beginner's sparring class. Her oath kept her silent the whole time. Was that silence integrity? Protecting a patient who never once asked to be protected? Or was it a luxury that a kid named Tyler ended up paying for on a mat that should have been far safer than it was? Tell us what you think in the comments below. If this story hit you, subscribe now. Share it with someone who respects quiet strength. And tell us in the comments which moment hit you the hardest. We will see you for the next story. It is already waiting.